So I did a bit of grounding earlier before I recorded my first video, my first attempt at this video, and still feel some of that centeredness, that energy, mental clarity. It's worth doing. Laying on the ground, trying to get some skin, say bare feet on the grass or the dirt. Maybe doing some deep breathing and letting the sun shine down on you, letting the energy of nature around you absorb, and appreciating the Great Mother. And we'll see if I can bring some of that energy into this second attempt at a presentation about a very important subject, which is men's mental health. Today is the final day of Men's Mental Health Month, the last day of June. And men's mental health is a very difficult subject to approach, to figure out how to address, to come up with solutions for the kind of problems that men face in their mental health struggles. It's very difficult for a lot of men to talk about their emotions. It's also reinforced in some subcultures to not talk about your emotions or even look at them. But looking at that kind of stuff, breaking out of avoidance, even if that's you avoiding pain within yourself, is part of being a strong, evolved man. But it's difficult. Men aren't supposed to talk about their emotions. Various people, sometimes the women in your life, sometimes the other men in your life, will not have patience for your struggles, for you talking about your pain and the things that are challenging you. A lot of men internalize. A lot of men use stoicism, which can be very useful, but also can be a great excuse or a bad excuse to avoid your emotions. And ultimately, part of mental health, maybe the central part of mental health, is looking at and recognizing the emotional turmoil within you, identifying the trauma, feeling it, looking at the roots of that trauma. In some cases, doing that with your own process, with the tools that you come upon in your life to try to unearth that and work it out. In some cases, that's with help, like from a therapist or maybe a close friend or even family member. But this stuff needs to be looked at, it needs to be discussed, and it needs to be faced. A lot of men make excuses not to face it. And it goes deep and affects them later in their life, limits them. So, Men's Mental Health Month. It's very important. Month of June every year. And I suppose more and more men are getting a little better at communicating what they're feeling. It's something that women seem to naturally be able to do. It's also culturally reinforced for women to talk about their discomfort, for women to express their feelings and do things like go to therapy. And that can be a very positive thing. It can also be a bit indulgent when women avoid responsibility and victimize themselves. We'll talk more about that soon. I would say for a lot of men, the worst pain that they experience, the scars that go the deepest and affect them the longest, are emotional. A lot of men will take on jobs that are very difficult and cause physical discomfort in various ways, and just integrate that into their life and struggle through it until they get used to it. A lot of men will even go to classes where you beat each other up, you do sparring, you break your body down at the gym, and actually it feels good. You come out of a sparring session, a class where you've tussled with someone else and tested your abilities. You might have a busted lip and a black eye, but you feel good. It develops a connection with your sparring partner. It shows you that you worked hard. We don't want to injure ourselves necessarily, but men do accept that you get bumps and scrapes along the road of being a man in life. And a lot of men recognize that those things will heal on the surface. The things under the surface that are often invisible, especially if they're not looked at, do not heal as well, as quickly, or in some cases at all. So sometimes men's mental health struggles are connected to the mental health patterns, negative adaptations, personality quirks, or flaws in those around them. It can be hard for some men to recognize that, especially if they're protective, if they have what can be a very noble trait of self-sacrifice. But a lot of men can get taken advantage of. There are a couple of mental health personality configurations that tend to be maybe the most common way that damage is inflicted upon men's hearts, minds, and spirits. One of those is avoidance, people with avoidant personality types. And the other is narcissism, particularly covert narcissism, which is quite often found in women. And so if you're a man that appreciates women, that wants to have relationships with women, sometimes it's hard to recognize covert narcissism or avoidant tendencies. A lot of men will suffer through confusing, manipulative, dishonest behavior and just try to do better, try to love more, try to be patient, try to forgive. All great qualities, but those very qualities that are in a lot of good men can be turned against them. So, I've spoken about avoidance in the last few videos, but there's whole personality types, avoidant personality types. I dated a woman that maybe, as I've spoken about in a previous video or a few videos, maybe had some narcissistic tendencies, covert, but really she identified that she was an avoidant personality type. I was with her for maybe 10 years, through the hardest part of both of our lives. She lost a parent, got sick quick and died. I had been dealing with illness with a parent who passed away soon after her parent passed away, and then my other parent got sick and died within a few years of that. And for most of our relationship I was dealing with sick and dying parents, along with a couple of chronic pain conditions that were very difficult to get a handle on and sort out and communicate to others. And during that 10-year relationship with this woman who was avoidant, I tried to speak about my desire for commitment, about my desire for certainty in the future, what the relationship meant, potential of kids, finding a common ground for our values, all these kinds of things that are part of developing a mature and lasting relationship. A committed relationship requires work, especially in the long term. They speak about the honeymoon phase. That can last different periods for different people. But in the long term, years upon years, especially when things like marriage or some sort of non-titled long-term commitment becomes a reality and then kids come into the picture, clarity, responsibility, effort, and compromise are all required to make a committed relationship last. I found over and over, as I tried to get that clarity from this woman, I got strung along. I guess there's a term called breadcrumbing, where someone will give you little bits of love or validation, just enough to keep you coming back. But when you really need more or expect a consistent flow of love in both directions, it's not there. But just enough to keep you hanging on. And I had some aspects of that. Breadcrumbing is usually spoken about in narcissism, but I think this was more to do with this woman's avoidant tendencies. And I kept speaking with a great deal of clarity and certainty about why I was there, what I wanted, and ultimately what I expected, and just kept getting strung along. And so 10 years elapsed. Now, we were dealing with very difficult things, so it wasn't just like I stuck around waiting. I was putting most of my energy into care, love, and trying to find the resilience to keep helping my folks. So the years passed by. Now, who knows if I wasn't mostly absorbed with trying to help my folks, if I would have broken things off earlier, but after about 10 years, maybe 10 months ago, last summer, I broke it off with this woman who was very avoidant. It's very difficult if you're a man who's straightforward, if you value direct communication and have the courage to move through conflict and difficulty to try to get to resolution, try to get to a stronger bond and better coping techniques for future conflict. It's difficult if you're that kind of man when you're dealing with avoidant people. I also had to, during the span of helping my folks, deal with an avoidant sibling who was very, very avoidant. We were sort of other ends of the spectrum. I was much more assertive. I would show up, I would throw myself into things and keep trying to sort it out, whatever it was. And the sibling would kind of do the opposite. While I was trying to help my folks and figure out my own health, time and time again, I was disappointed at the lack of self-motivated offering of assistance or involvement from this sibling. And so I had to, time and time again, request their involvement and at times push for and even demand their involvement, partly because it seemed important for this child of my parents to be involved in the end of their life, and partly because I was overwhelmed at times and needed help. Aside from the fact that I had a largely misplaced sense of camaraderie, expectation of responsibility from this sibling. And I realize in hindsight that they didn't have that available. That just wasn't in them. I'm glad that I exerted the pressure on them to be involved and take certain responsibilities, because they were so avoidant and passive that they would have sat back and barely been there. One of the coping techniques that to me was very sad, and I would strongly suggest, no matter your personality type or your trauma, that you don't approach a sick parent's life with, was mourning their death. Whatever they're dealing with, whatever your parent is sick with, don't mourn their death before they pass, because you're going to let the parent down, and you're going to let anyone else that has actually showed up to try to help at that great time of need, you're going to let them down. My mother had Alzheimer's, and I think that there is a general idea from some people, depending on their approach to life and consciousness and belief system, that the brain is where everything exists. And the brain is definitely a part of this complex gift, this mechanism, this body that we're all given when we are born. But there's a lot more going on than just electrical activity in the brain. There's everything that happens within the body itself. And then there is the field around the body. There is the spark of spirit that everyone carries within their vessel. And no matter the stage of development or decline that a person is going through, it's still them. Until that last breath, the vessel contains the essence of that person. So don't give up, no matter who they are. Don't mourn your loved one before they die. It's a coping mechanism that I had to deal with the sibling, and it made it difficult for the sibling to show up, I think. I was facing over and over the constant drastic changes within months or a year or two that my mother was going through. But I knew that my mother, once upon a time, was a little baby that couldn't speak, and then was a young girl with all her own particular personality expressions and ways of communicating as she was a little girl, and then a young woman, and then a grown woman, and then I met her when I was born, and the sibling met her when they were born. All the different stages of the expression of that divine spark of awareness that my mother carried within her vessel. Until the last breath, that's all just a different part of a person's story. And if you love them, you got to show up till the end, till that last breath. And depending on your responsibilities for their estate, even a little bit beyond. So I had to deal with this kind of avoidance with this sibling. Many attempts to try to bring this sibling into the picture for social time, for different responsibilities. This sibling definitely showed up here and there to face some responsibilities, but the many, many times that I went and provided company to my mom, a lot of it was alone, and most of it was without the sibling there as well, in spite of my many attempts to involve them. And this avoidance cost me, cost my mom, a great deal. So avoidant personality types, harms many men. Many men that are loving and courageous and that do show up get left as sometimes the only one to try to cope with very difficult challenges. So, like I have spoken about within the last few videos, avoidance can be a bitch. Whether you're a man or a woman, whatever your personality type is, when people are in need that you love, it's worth showing up. It's worth struggling through, getting up even if you get knocked down, and being there authentically, trying to breathe through the pain, trying to figure it out. In the long run, it makes you stronger. It's part of why we're here. It's why we're challenged in this way, to learn these lessons. But if you don't attend class, if you don't show up, you can't really learn them. You miss the opportunity to grow in that way. So show up, don't avoid, be there. I'm sure you can. If I can, you definitely can.